The first column of British settlers arrived in Mashonaland in 1890, in what is today Zimbabwe. The territory was named Rhodesia after the English imperialist Cecil Rhodes. The pleasant climate and fertile soil was ideal for farming, and by 1900, 16 million acres of the country's 96 million had been handed to white settlers. In 1923, the country became the self-governing colony of southern Rhodesia, with 50,000 white settlers controlling a population of 1 million black Africans. After the Second World War, the Rhodesians expected Britain to grant the colony full independence as a reward for their loyal support. But there was opposition to white rule from other African states. Although Rhodesia did not practice apartheid or segregation, only a few blacks were eligible to vote. The white minority objected to the principle of one man, one vote, as they feared the chaos and bloodshed that had followed black majority rule in neighboring Congo. The British government, under Harold Wilson, failed to reach an agreement with the white Rhodesians under Ian Smith. In 1965, Rhodesia rebelled against Britain with a unilateral declaration of independence known simply as UDI. An angry Wilson persuaded the United Nations to impose sanctions on the rebels, and for the next 15 years, Rhodesia, with intermittent backing from South Africa, was on its own.
Rhodesia had hardly been settled, and when the Anglo-Boer War broke out, they all flocked to fight for Britain against the Boers. Then the First World War broke out. To neuter the population, they all took off again. In the Second World War, they had to bring conscription in, not to call blokes up, it was to stop the whole population disappearing, because we were a small population. And so if you were what they called a key man, you weren't allowed to go.
I was born in Rhodesia. My family have very deep roots in that country. My grandfather was a pioneer. My great-uncle died on the Shangani River with Alan Wilson's last stand, which in Rhodesian history is a great chapter of history.
We always considered ourselves British, didn't we? My father comes from Greenford in Middlesex. He signed up on 26th of September 1939 to fight in the war. My mother was, although of 1820 settler stock, her family came from Aberdeen in Scotland. So we were English. You know, Rhodesia was made up of all sorts of different communities from Europe.
By the late 60s, guerrilla action by African political groups against white rule in Rhodesia escalated into civil war. The guerrillas were split into two armed factions. Zanla, led by Robert Mugabe, was backed by Red China, and Zipra, led by Joshua Nkomo, was backed by Communist Russia. The small but highly efficient Rhodesian security forces were faced with a major insurgency by well-armed guerrillas. Fortunately, a few key soldiers had gained valuable experience with the British Army fighting a similar campaign in Malaya during the 1950s. One of them was Rhodesian-born Ron Reed Daly.
I was very lucky that as a very young soldier, in a moment of madness, I volunteered to go over and became part of the SAS, the British SAS. And that was a fantastic initiation into special force tactics and training, particularly in those jungle conditions, and became involved in a new, for me, type of military thinking, i.e. special forces. When the RLI started and I was brought in to be the RSM, I had quite a depth of a background to draw from. So it was, I don't think I would have managed it if I hadn't had that experience. You see, Rhodesia never had an insurgency problem, but we were watching around us very carefully because Kenya had gone on straight after Malaya. So our School of Infantry then started producing the doctrines and the dogma and writing pamphlets on the tactics to be used, which were basically the same ones in Malaya. Now, while those tactics were militarily sound, very sound, what we didn't do is say, look, they worked well in Malaya, but are they going to work in Africa? And of course, there's a vast difference between the jungles of Malaya and the bush of Rhodesia.
Quick to adapt to new training and tactics, the Rhodesian Light Infantry soon established a reputation as formidable bushfighters.
The Rhodesian is a different sort of military animal. You know, he doesn't like this drudgery and this old slogging infantry type role. So to attract more recruits, they decided to change it, give it a commando role, where we now embarked on special force type training and, you know, rock climbing, all that sort of stuff. And it worked very well.
When I left school, I decided to try and join the regular army and applied to go to the Rhodesian African Rifles. And I did 3 years with them. Without any reference to me, I was posted to the Rhodesian Light Infantry.
18 at school, you got your papers. I left in the December. The school had written my GCEs. January the 8th, that's it, you were in the army, you know. There was a whole crowd of us at school saying we're all leaving together. Well, let's all go and apply for the RLI. And we all got accepted. Well, I think if you could walk there, you got accepted. But you know, it was fairly rigorous. The first 4 months training was really hard on us all.
The way this recruiting team arrived, they were the only ones at that time wearing full camouflage. They came in open Land Rovers, and yeah, it just seemed a glamorous thing to do, really. Eh?
The reputation of the RLI was pretty good at the time, even before the war. That's when I joined. The RLI selection course or recruits course, was very difficult. And I was 17 and a half years old, and very small, so it was very difficult for me. But I seemed to manage.
I went off and I spent 3 months on a medics course, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. And that was mainly working down at Impila Hospital, which was a big black hospital in the southern part of the country. You know, so Friday and Saturday nights you'd spend your life stitching people up and, you know, getting training, on-the-job training with it. And came back, and I actually came back as 3 commanders medic.
When I'd finished training troop after about 16 weeks, I then suddenly discovered to my horror that I actually had to do a para course. I think I knew that I had to do a para course, but it didn't strike me until I'd actually finished that it meant the next thing to do was jump out of aeroplanes.
So in their 4.5 months of recruit course, anyone that wasn't going to make the grade would be, you know, weeded out.
If you look at that unit, you know, there was characters throughout. The police used to hate them, you know, because when they went into town, they'd wreck the place. You know, it's Club Tomorrow would be taken over for the night and so on. So it went from being a really rough unit to becoming a fairly balanced one, you know, because I said when the National Service went in, the intelligence level of that unit trebled, you know, because there was no intelligence there to start with. But they were really good soldiers.
We weren't mercenaries. We were professional soldiers. We had really nowhere to go. That was our home. For us Rhodesians, you know, of course, later on, we had a large element of foreigners coming to fight in the army, and we were very appreciative of that.
Being accused by their enemies of acting as mercenaries did not deter the foreign volunteers. Former Royal Navy pilot Mike Borlas was one of them.
In the middle 70s, I had the choice of either going to Oman or Rhodesia. I chose to go to Rhodesia. The war got going shortly after. I thought it was a cause very worth fighting for. I think it was very misunderstood in the world. The word mercenary is, I think we all understand, is very emotive and is certainly used by the Eastern Bloc sympathisers to engender bad feeling against anybody that supports a cause other than their own. They don't class, for instance, putting Russian advisors, Cuban advisors to help the guerrillas as mercenaries, but that's a propaganda type thing. Certainly within the Rhodesian forces there were no mercenaries. There were people that came from other lands, some out of conviction and some because they had not got the sort of life that they wanted in their own forces. I mean, a lot of soldiers want to go into combat. A lot of people want to see how they can operate. So in actual fact, there weren't that many foreigners in the Air Force, but there were a lot in the Rhodesian Light Infantry, for instance. They were all part of the security forces and we got paid exactly the same as any Rhodesian in the security force.
When I was commissioned as a training officer for the RLI. And I said I knew what was coming up. The training in the RLI was very, very good. You know, those recruits, when they came out, they were highly trained. Of course, the proof of the pudding is when you first go into action. And they were straight off. Huge success. The first big operation, for example, was called Cauldron. I think about 135 terrorists came over from Zambia. And the RLI got into those and we killed about 68, captured about another 30 or so, and about 20 or so got back to Zambia. And I think we lost six RLI chaps. And there we started developing Rhodesian tactics, push tactics, combined with the helicopters. Because we had a wonderful little Air Force as well. It really was, the helicopter pilots. And we had a great feeling of togetherness, and we worked very well together.
The Rhodesian Air Force, when the war really sort of got going in 74, 75, was described as one of the best pocket air forces in the world, certainly one of the best in Africa.
Even at its peak, the Rhodesian Air Force had only 150 pilots. Although they were trained to fly all types of aircraft, giving the Air Force considerable flexibility, it was difficult to recruit combat helicopter pilots.
Well, the Alouette was an extremely good bush helicopter, and it was its limitation which caused a lot of the challenges we faced in the war was its size. The G-car was basically the trooping aircraft, and that carried a pilot, a technician who was also the machine gunner, but was also responsible for keeping the aircraft airworthy, and a stick of 4 soldiers. The reason the Army chose to use sticks of 4 was because that was the weight of soldiers we could take in the Alouette with the 2 crew. Weight is a critical factor always in helicopter operations, and in the sort of temperatures and some of the heights we were operating there, it was crucial. We were very, very limited on weight. Technically, I think we were probably flying overloaded the whole time. The K-car was the same airframe, but fitted with a 20mm cannon, and was used for 2 things. One was to provide very close support to the troops. Secondly, it was to give the Army the chance to have a tactical commander above the battle where he could manoeuvre the troops.
Can you pick up the target? Yeah, I'm turning it.
The K-car could, if you wanted to do that, carry more fuel in it. Personally, I prefer to carry either more ammunition or to have a little longer fuel than the G-cars. But the G-cars with a stick of troops on were limited to about an hour's flying. And fuel management was, to my mind, one of the big tasks. I mean, even having arrived at a scene, engaged the enemy, you had to try and arrange it so that not everybody was away from the battle at the same time. There was fuel throughout the operational area, which in the end, of course, was the whole country. And we would never be more than 30 minutes away from some fuel somewhere. Interestingly enough, there were also other dumps where fuel was on the top of mountains that were inaccessible other than by a helicopter. So at some stage in the future, somebody's going to wonder what all these fuel drums were doing on the top of these isolated mountains.
With trade sanctions against Rhodesia making it difficult to obtain new aircraft or even spare parts, the adaptable engineers became expert at keeping the Air Force flying.
A lot of the helicopters were rebuilt. The engineers were excellent at getting very severely damaged aircraft rebuilt. When engines were taken out in the bush, they were able to effect engine changes in the bush. Despite what you see in movies, helicopter blades rarely fly off. They can take a lot of damage. You may lose some lift with them. The vulnerable points of a helicopter are the tail rotor, particularly, the fuel line, which will stop the engine, and of course the pilot. Losing anybody is a problem to a small country. Losing aircrew particularly was a major problem.
As the guerrilla war escalated, so did losses in men and material. As a result, helicopter pilots found their operational duties increasing.
We would deploy on Fire Force duties, and then if there were any external operations or the SAS were doing something funny, we would support them as well. And of course we were on continual standby for Casevac. So all these roles would just be carried out by the same small unit. So the helicopter pilots did a lot of flying. There may have been a perceived glamour, but we certainly were the hardest working people in the war.
Loved them. Thought they were some of the best in the world. You know, they would drop you on a penny. You know, they really were good. We all had great respect for the guys. So
that's a sort of $64 million question. What makes a good combat pilot? And it was probably the same in any war there's ever been. That some of the most unlikely people become very, very good under fire. And it's also one of those things that very few people know, or it's very difficult for somebody else to predict how somebody will react under fire.
Mike, he was brave, I wouldn't say foolhardy, but he was so anxious to get the guys right in, he sort of dumped them right on top of the bloody, so to speak, you know. And we couldn't afford helicopters at the drop of a hat, you know. These were precious items to us.
There were several people killed by small arms fire from the ground. Aircraft shot down, helicopters shot down on a reasonably high frequency from 1976 onwards.
there was a day where 2 of the chopper pilots got killed. That sticks in my memory, you know, and basically through the head, they didn't know. Fortunately, they were either coming as landing or as they're coming out. But no soldiers were killed, but 2 pilots in one day.
Nobody feels pleasant about being shot at, but funnily enough, you can actually get used to it. Certainly, no pilots, no aircrew were ever taken. Our battles tended to be to the death sort of thing. Even on the cross-border raids, people were either shot down and killed, or they got back. As far as I was concerned, the big secret was to neutralise the enemy's fire. And like everything, that means it's like a street fight. Get in there quickly, put down a lot of fire, and show them who's got the big stick.
The Rhodesian Light Infantry was a key weapon in counterinsurgency operations. Adopting a paratroop commando role, they developed a concept known as Fire Force, which carried the fight by helicopter and parachute to the very heart of the enemy. The battalion was made up of 4 commandos.
We had at a headquarters a commando, 100 men, 70 men, it depended, who were on standby, and when someone, whoever it was, had a sighting or had good evidence of a terrorist presence, the Fire Force deployed in helicopters to engage the enemy in a firefight.
Well, the Fire Force itself is really quite an old military concept. It equates to, in days of yore, of having a reserve, which was normally the cavalry. The Rhodesians very quickly had to use that as our primary fighting force, because the problem we always had with our very small army and very small air force was getting to fight the enemy. The guerrillas' position was that they would try and avoid combat as long as they could. My experience of Fire Force, if they were there and We got them contained and got the RLI on the ground. Generally, we won.
The stops were helicopters which carried 4 soldiers in what we called a stick. And what would happen is they'd be deployed and they'd sweep an area until they came under contact, as when they were actually fired upon.
The actual assault group would be parried in 500 feet, which, depending on the temperature and height above sea level, normally gave you about 20 seconds from the time you left the aeroplane to hitting the ground. And that was there simply because, go out any higher, you lost the element of surprise, number one. And also, there was no Geneva Convention rules for the group. So it was quite common to be shot at under a canopy.
The RLI had the record of the number of combat jumps which an individual took place in one day, parachuting into action. There was also a descent by an officer who got 14 bullet holes through his parachute canopy.
Combat is a very confusing situation for anybody, particularly initially, when they're not even sure if they're allowed to open fire, and that sort of, it sounds very stupid almost. If you've only fired on a range and then you don't move anything until somebody tells you to. I've had several people who said, well, we weren't actually sure if we were allowed to open fire, But that's a lesson they learned very quickly.
I was involved in the very first operation, Christmas 1972, when initially Whistlefield Farm was hit. And I was part of a small group, of support group as it was, and that was the occasion when we hit a landmine just outside of the farmhouse. And when Lance Corporal Paddy Moore was killed, Trooper Butwater lost his legs, and we went on follow-up directly after that. I was in the vehicle travelling behind that. Now you can imagine, as an 18-year-old troopie, come out of a very middle-class family, being brought up in a nice, safe little village or town called Marindellis, perfect childhood, suddenly thrown into this type of thing. It was a shocking experience for me.
People were getting shot all the time, but normally what would happen, when I went back as the commander medic, generally what would happen, you would actually sit in a chopper or you would be in a Paradak. The troop medic would have stabilised the person, and then you jump in and you would actually put a chest drain in or tube them or whatever it was that you needed to do. You always looked after your own guys first. That no one will tell you any different. There was many times you would have where the civilians were shot up. It would generally be the terrorists that would have gone into a kraal and actually taken out the kraal, and killed and maimed a whole lot of people, and you would have arrived there to actually sort it out, and you'd walk in there and there might be 20 or 30 of them, and you would go around and make a quick assessment, say, that person I can save, that one I can't. And there was many times you did that.
An incident that always sticks in my mind, which shows to me what the whole character of the RLI was, I was with 2 Commando on one occasion, and as it happened, this was the 3rd contact we'd had that day before breakfast, and 2 had got themselves into a riverbed where they couldn't be seen from the air, and the 2 Commando commander moved up a stick of troops, and there was no cover at all. It was just this open area, and as they were coming out of dead ground, we warned them that we weren't sure where these guys were, other than that they were probably in cover in this riverbed. And I distinctly remember seeing the fire from an RPD hitting the ground where these troops were. And none of them they never even considered taking cover. They just sort of turned half right and charged over about 50 metres of open ground, and a couple of minutes later there was a very laconic report that there were 2 dead bodies there. And the surprising part of that to me, when we met these guys later on in the day, is that they were all 18 years old.
The Rhodesian army was 80% black. Many people would wonder what would motivate the black element of the Rhodesian army to fight as ferociously as their white comrades. And I think it was the common understanding that we were fighting for the survival of our homeland. The Rhodesian African Rifles and the chaps in the Salute Scouts and in the other regiments that had black soldiers in, They were just as well trained as everyone else, and they responded to that training just as much as anybody else did. And so, whatever tribe they came from, just like whatever white tribe we came from, we were soldiers. We had the same training, we had the same discipline, we had the same focus.
You had the SS, the Scouts, and the RLI. We would have grouped ourselves, in the same. The SS always said, no, we're better, and they were probably one step ahead of us because they had more specialist skills within it. The Scouts were very much into clandestine work. They'd work 2-man, 3-man patrols and go as far as Tanzania, to look for camps. So they had a different role, and we were really, the dogs on the ground sort of stuff, go in and sort it out.
As the war raged, both Zanla and Zipra guerrillas began flooding into Rhodesia, terrorizing the civilian population. In retaliation, the Rhodesians hit enemy bases and other strategic targets in a series of cross-border raids.
As the war went on, we started spending a lot more time in Mozambique and in Zambia. So we really became the terrorists in their country. So our roles did change quite significantly over the time.
The Rhodesian Special Forces became more daring as they penetrated deep into enemy territory.
We lay in ambush, and this BTR came along, and it was with Frelimo troops. So we ambushed it successfully, but then along came some T-34 tank. So of course we had to leave the area, and it chased us all night, followed by troops, until daylight, until our Air Force supported us and we were extracted by helicopter.
When you went into Mozambique, the sheer numbers you were up against was fairly daunting, but definitely when you went into Zambia, the Zambian guys were a lot more better trained and much better dug in. And we came across a lot of the resistance there.
We picked up tracks on a road. There was about 10 of us, and the tracks were crossing the road, but we had a tracker. And when Lieutenant Bert Sachs got out the vehicle, he went in one direction, but the tracker said, no, don't go in that direction, and they're walking backwards across the road. And the chaps went through the bush and heard the clattering of tins, and they were eating their food in the riverbed. And we initiated firing. Out of 13, we got 10.
One of the most spectacular Rhodesian successes was achieved when a combined Army and Air Force operation hit the Zanla guerrilla base at Chimoio, deep inside Mozambique.
It was claimed by ZANU-PF that it actually was a refugee camp, but in fact, it was a camp that was actually training the ZANU-PF soldiers, the Zanla soldiers, to come and infiltrate into Rhodesia at that point.
The raid took about 18 months in the planning, and it was set up with the Air Force, the whole of the RLI, and the SAS.
I was only the commander for about 5 months when we did Chimoio. That was a big one. I remember that at the time when we were briefed at New Salem before we dropped, we were told there'd be 25% casualties. And I kept thinking, looking at the people around me, thinking that's 1 in 4, there's going to be an awful lot of people killed.
Soldiers were taken in Dakotas and parachuted on 3 sides to try and inbox the camp, and we had 10 gunships which were sealing the other side of the camp, and then heliborne troops were brought in to seal that side of the camp as well. The raid took place over 2 days. Despite the early jet strikes, there was an awful lot of flak. It's certainly the worst flak I've ever personally been involved in.
At Chimoio, the Rhodesians inflicted over 1,000 casualties on the guerrillas for the loss of only 2 of their own.
When we actually landed there was Russian-made 12.7 anti-aircraft rifles. There was weapons all over the place. Soldiers who we killed were actually dressed in uniform. All were carrying weapons as well. At the time, we were unaware of how important it was, other than that we had to actually do the job. We were told later there was somewhere in the region of 1,200 casualties on the enemy side.
It was a very well-planned exercise, and it was led by Norman Walsh, who I think at the time was a group captain and who was director of operations in the Air Force. What a pity he was not the commander a lot earlier than he became. There again, the war may have taken a different turn. He was a very aggressive pilot who also was the highest ranking pilot we had in the Air Force who knew about helicopter operations. So, you know, it would have made a lot of sense for him to be the commander a lot earlier than he was.
As the guerrillas acquired better weapons, Rhodesian army casualties mounted.
When we first went, if you had maybe one person that was killed every 3 months in your unit, remember there was about 120 of you per commander. On an average, one guy was killed every 3 months. You know, it suddenly got up to where there's 5, 6, 7 of you killed or badly injured.
No sooner I had laced my boots up than we actually called out to an area called the Merenki, which is just in the south of Mutare. I dropped into the Merenki. We hit the ground and we started to sweep. I was the last man on the right-hand side of the sweep line, and we were told to move to our right by about 100 meters. I turned and moved to the right, and as we came towards some very thick bush, and I started turning to the left, from about 3 meters away, someone opened up with an AK. I was shot in the side of the face. The bullet exited through my left eye. I have memories of things happening, so I didn't lose consciousness. I do remember, for example, my corporal, Grant Hughes, coming and saying, "Pillars, can you run?" And I told him I could. We got up to run towards a chopper which had landed, and we got revved. We got fired on by another group of tourists. The helicopter took off because it was obviously taking flak. Another helicopter came down. I remember getting into the helicopter, and the techie put his hand on my arm and went, "Are you okay?" And then I don't remember much else, to be honest, until I woke up 2 or 3 days later.
Wonderful soldiers, as tough as nails, with a sense of humour which was part of the characteristic of the RLI.
He said, "Ron, you're a Rhodesian. I'm a Rhodesian. We're born Rhodesians, eh?"
We were defending our land from the threat, as it was then, of communism. That was our home. We had nothing else.
The Rhodesian Special Forces may have won their battles, but the war was eventually lost. The overwhelming number of guerrillas, South Africa turning off the oil tap, and the general lack of supplies finally wore the Rhodesian forces down. A UN-backed ceasefire was called, and elections held in 1980. Robert Mugabe became president of the newly named Zimbabwe. It is a time remembered with mixed emotions.
I think the Rhodesians were probably one of their own worst enemies. They were very naive about how they thought the world looked at them, and had they dealt with that in a better way, they had a country that racially was probably the most acceptable that it's ever going to be in Africa.
Politics is a dirty business, as we all know, and the South Africans let us down probably worse than the Brits. At least the Brits, we knew they were trying to get rid of us.
We knew the end was coming, and that was most unfortunate. Rather difficult time, if I may say, for all of us, whether you were the commander or a trooper. It was a difficult time.
We were led right to the very last day. There was always going to be a plan B, right to the day that the elections were getting announced. It was no ways that Mugabe would come in. It would be Nkomo and Muzarewa would have a plan for us. And if that wasn't going to happen, plan B would have come in. Plan B apparently was on the table, but was never actually shown to anyone. No, it really was to take out, it was going to be a coup. That would have been what plan B was.
Well, actually, we were a bit like mushrooms because we were kept in the dark and fed on it, and we didn't really know. And I would go up to the level of the commanding officers of the battalions didn't know. When we go higher, I think they knew and the politicians knew, but we weren't being informed.
On a personal level, I was very confident that they would lead us in the right way, as they always had done. Maybe that was a bit naive.
It was a phase in our lives. We've gone through that phase. Looking back on it now, we should have never gone through that. The politicians should have sorted something out. We were brainwashed from a very early age.
Politically, we were being starved, and South Africa was under pressure. We couldn't get ammunition. But militarily-wise, we were fine. But when they said, we're folding up, the battalions are folding up like the RLI and the Salute Scouts, we were devastated.
The terrible drama of ending that battalion, I will never forget. Wonderful, wonderful people. And I mean that. It sounds as if I'm overdoing it, but I mean that.
During its brief history, the Rhodesian Light Infantry had accounted for over 12,000 enemy guerrillas, for the loss of 134 killed. An extraordinary record in military history.
I would say in our sphere and in our time, there were very few units in the world could come up to the expertise of the RLI.
We marched off with the regimental march when the Saints go marching in. It went extremely well, everyone extremely calm. I'll never forget it for the rest of my life.
Within a few short years of Mugabe gaining power, the predictions about him came true. Ancient tribal tensions erupted into violence, and government corruption completely destroyed the once thriving economy. Under Mugabe's brutal dictatorship, millions of people perished.
All of us knew, and I think we've been proven right, haven't we? Robert Mugabe was the person we believed him to be.
Well, I think the feeling of "I told you so" came very quickly. In a way, people, a lot of ex-Rhodesians, I think, quite surprised that the country lasted as long as it did before sliding into the situation that it's become.
Ian Smith had warned the British government that this wasn't a very nice chap. They didn't listen to him. However, he had a landslide, so he won, and we know what has happened since.
We must never forget the Gukura Hundi, 10 to 20,000 Matabele murdered by the Mugabe government. And he has yet to answer for those criminal acts, war crimes.
Of course, the amazing thing is that a lot of the sort of tree-hugging liberals in this part of the world and America, who Mugabe was their sort of man, you hear very little from them now that he's become nobody's man.
The real meaning of the trooper statue and symbolism of the rededication can only be known by those who served. For some, the experience in the Rhodesian Light Infantry has continued to influence their lives in one form or another.
Today I work for His Majesty King Lecker of Albania. I started off in close protection for him, organising his security. He was invited back to his own country in 2002.
And in '94, I opened my own IT company, and we run all the medical associations in South Africa. Everything from anaesthetics to vascular surgeons.
And of course, becoming a padre made sense of my past, you know. So I think my training ground for the ministry was actually the RLI and the Silly Scouts.
That we just stand before God in prayer on behalf of others.
You will never get closer to your human brother than you do in the military, and not closer in the military as in the military at war.
You know, I read somewhere just recently where this chap said that it's amazing how a few years of war can affect a man's whole life. And I knew exactly what he's talking about.
And it's right in life that my grandchildren can see that memorial where their ancestors came from.
So I think this will be the point where it all ends, and I think that'll be good, because I think everyone will now say, that's where our regiment now lives, and that's where our regiment's memories will now live, and that'll be good.